Hello, my dear listeners. Welcome back to Sleepy Story Haven, that quiet, unhurried place we return to together when the rest of the world has finally made itself sufficiently loud that we need, with some urgency, to find the nearest door marked out and step through it into somewhere softer, somewhere slower. Somewhere that asks nothing of you except that you arrive and breathe and stay a little while. I'm glad you're here tonight. I mean that the way I always mean it, simply and without performance. Whatever shape today took for you, whatever it asked and whatever it withheld, you are here now, and here is a good place to be. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about a house, about going home when home has changed, about the things that old places hold inside their walls, the memories pressed into the plaster and the floorboards, and the particular quality of light that falls through a window you haven't looked through in 20 years, about grief, which is the strangest form of love, because it is love with nowhere left to go, and what happens when it goes somewhere unexpected. And about rain. Rain specifically, because there is something about rain in old houses and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a moor in the late afternoon of November. A quiet that is not the absence of sound, but a very specific and deliberate arrangement of sounds, each in its proper register. That seems to me to be among the most conducive atmospheres that nature has ever produced for the receiving of truths you were not ready to receive on drier, more ordinary days. I've been thinking lately about the way we carry our childhood homes inside us long after we've left them. Not as memories, exactly. Memories are things you can take out and examine and put back. I mean something more structural than that, more involuntary. The way your body knows how many steps it takes to cross a particular kitchen even after 2 decades. The way the smell of a certain kind of old wood or a particular brand of washing powder or rain on stone can return you to a place so completely that the intervening years feel briefly very thin, like paper held up to a strong light, suddenly transparent. There is a word in the Welsh language, hiraeth, that describes a kind of longing for home that is not simply homesickness. It is a longing for a version of home, or a version of yourself at home, that perhaps no longer exists and perhaps never existed in quite the form you're longing for. A longing that is mixed with grief and mixed with beauty, and that has, at its core, the bittersweet recognition that you cannot go back, not because the place is gone, but because you are different, and the going back will always be a new kind of going, not a return. Tonight's story is about that feeling, about a woman who goes back to the house she grew up in, not by choice, but by necessity, in the way that grief creates its own itinerary and finds that the house has been waiting for her. Not in a frightening way, in the way that very old, very patient things wait, with the certainty that the waiting will eventually resolve into arrival. With all the things unsaid between two people who loved each other imperfectly and lost the time to say them, properly held in its walls like rain and stone, like warmth and wool, like all the things that are absorbed by the places we live in and released slowly when the conditions are finally right for release. This story is entirely original to Sleepy Story Haven. It is mine, written for you, for this channel, for these long, quiet evenings we spend together. There are no other sources to credit, no other voices to acknowledge, only the story itself and the two of us in the night. Before we go in, a small and genuine word of gratitude to those of you who support this channel on Patreon. You are the reason these long, careful, unhurried episodes exist. The link is always in the description below, along with the full written script for this episode, which goes up for supporters the same day as the audio. We are a small community and a quiet one, and every single person in it matters to me more than the numbers suggest. No, I want you to close your eyes if you haven't already. Imagine it is November. The gray, serious part of November, when autumn has finished its long, beautiful withdrawal and the world has settled into the particular stripped-back honesty of the year's final season. The trees are bare. The light is low and indirect, arriving at an angle that makes everything look considered, as if the landscape has been thinking about itself and arrived at some difficult but necessary clarity. Imagine a road through a moor. Single lane, pale tarmac grayed further by the weather, bordered on both sides by the particular moorland vegetation of late autumn, the heather gone brown now, the bracken collapsed to rust and copper, the occasional outcrop of dark stone standing in the low light like something that has been there since before the road existed and regards it with a degree of tolerant skepticism. In the distance, a line of hills, low, rounded, the kind of hills that have worn away over so many thousands of years that they have acquired the muted, settled dignity of things that are done competing with the sky and have arrived at a comfortable arrangement. And at the end of a track that forks off the road between two old dry stone walls, a house. Stone, of course. Dark gray stone, the color of the hills, as if it grew from the same source. 2 stories, 6 windows, a door of heavy oak beneath a porch so covered in the dead remains of last summer's wisteria that you can barely see the lintel. A garden that has made its own decisions in the absence of its keeper and stands now in a state of beautiful, principled overgrowth. The kind that happens when nature is given time to negotiate with the human arrangements that were briefly imposed upon it. The house is called Fell Cottage. It has been empty for 3 weeks, and a woman named Constance is driving toward it now alone in a rented car with her coat in the back seat and a box of her mother's favorite tea on the passenger seat because she could not bring herself to leave it behind when she cleared the hospital room in this scene. At the time, and still seems now, entirely reasonable. She has not been back in 20 years. The house is waiting for her. Settle in, my dear wanderers. Let the rain come. We're going home. The house that remembered rain. The rain began 40 minutes outside the village of Hareswick, arriving not dramatically, no sudden downpour, no theatrical darkening of the sky, but in the gradual, deliberate way of northern English rain, which has the patience and the confidence to take its time. It started as a dampening of the windscreen that barely warranted the wipers and built, over the course of several miles, into the steady, gray, unhurried rainfall that Constance felt associated more viscerally with her childhood than almost any other sensory memory. More than the smell of the house, more than the sound of her mother's particular walk on the upstairs floorboards, more than anything she could consciously name. This rain. She turned the wipers up a notch and watched the more open on both sides of the road and felt her body do something before her mind caught up, a long, slow exhalation that was not quite relief and not quite dread and was, she would have to admit, a version of recognition. Her body knew this road. Her body had known this road for 38 years, since the first time she had been driven along it as a newborn, arriving for the first time at the house in which she would spend the first 18 years of her life, and then, with the decisive efficiency of a person who is not ready to examine why she is leaving quite so completely leave. She was 38 now. The same age her mother had been when Constance left for university in the South and did not return for Christmas that year, and sent a card for her mother's birthday in February that was carefully affectionate and carefully vague about when she might next be home. The arithmetic of this had been sitting in her chest for 3 weeks, since the phone call from the hospital, like a stone placed there by someone who intended to come back for it and had not yet returned. The track appeared between the two dry stone walls exactly as she remembered it, the walls perhaps a little more worn, a stone or two in each shifted by the slow, imperceptible movement of old mortarless construction over 20 years, but recognizable. The gate at the entrance to the track was new. Or rather, it had been replaced at some point in the last 2 decades. It was the same style, the same black painted iron, but without the particular lean to the right that the old gate had developed, a lean which her mother had regarded with a fond tolerance she extended to all imperfections that were too old and too established to be worth correcting. Constance drove through the open gate and along the track, which was rutted now in a way she didn't remember, the puddles and the wheel ruts reflecting the gray sky in long, irregular fragments. The dry stone walls on either side were colonized at their tops with moss and grass in the way that moorland walls are when they haven't been maintained. Not collapse, nothing so dramatic, but a slow softening at the edges, a gradual reclamation by the vegetation that never quite accepted the wall's presence as permanent. And then the house appeared. She had prepared herself for this moment during the long drive from London. 4 hours with the radio on, and then off, and then on again. The landscape changing slowly from the frantic congestion of the South to the wider, emptier, more honestly proportioned landscapes of the North. She had prepared herself in the way you prepare for a thing you don't know how to prepare for, by acknowledging that preparation is largely fictional and that the actual moment will be its own thing entirely. Still, she stopped the car at the end of the track where it widened into the small turning area in front of the garden gate, and she sat in the stationary car with the engine off and the rain on the roof, close now, intimate, The particular percussion of rain on a car roof being one of the most private sounds she knew, the sound of being enclosed in something small while the world is large and wet outside, and she looked at the house. It looked back. This was not a fanciful thought. She was not by temperament a fanciful person. She was a structural engineer, a profession chosen she had come to understand in the years since the choice was made, not in spite of her childhood in this house, but because of it. Because growing up in a building this old, this settled, this unambiguously present, had given her a profound and deeply rooted sense of the relationship between structure and time, between the materials we use to build our lives and the forces those materials must accommodate across the years. She understood, better than most people, that buildings are not passive. They respond to what is done in them. They carry the record of their own history in the way they have settled, the way they have cracked and been repaired, the way the floors have worn where they have been most walked upon, and retained their original surface where no one ever stood. Buildings were, in her professional opinion, the most honest record keepers she had ever encountered. They could not lie. They could only hold and reveal. She got out of the car into the rain. The garden gate opened with a sound she had not consciously remembered, but which arrived now in her chest with the full, unmediated force of something that has been stored for 20 years at full intensity, waiting for exactly this acoustic trigger. The creak of that specific hinge, not mechanical, not random, but a specific note produced by that specific gate in that specific state of wear, was so precisely the sound of being 7 years old and arriving home from school that Constance stood with her hand on the open gate for a moment and breathed very carefully and waited for the feeling to pass through her rather than trying to stop it. It passed through. She walked up the garden path. The wisteria over the porch was a tangle of bare woody stems, the dead seed pods still hanging in clusters, pale and papery. In summer, this porch was a spectacle. She had a memory, one of those composite memories built from many instances rather than a single occasion, of arriving home through a tunnel of purple and the particular sweet sharp smell of wisteria in full bloom, so dense on hot days that it was almost dizzying. That memory seemed very distant from this November morning. She found the house key in her coat pocket. The solicitor had couriered it in an envelope that was precisely professionally impersonal, along with a letter about the estate that she had read once and put in a drawer, and stood for a moment at the front door. The door was exactly the same. Of course it was. She knew it was. And yet the knowledge had not quite prepared her for the reality of standing in front of it, the dark oak, the slightly raised grain where the wood had swollen and dried through decades of wet winters and dry summers, the iron knocker in the shape of a fox's head that her mother had bought at an antique fair somewhere in the Dales when Constance was very small, and which Constance had always, as a child, touched briefly on the way and as a kind of ritual greeting, a small acknowledgement of continuity. She touched it now. Then she turned the key and opened the door and stepped inside. The smell of the house arrived first, as it always does when you enter an old building that has been closed up for several weeks. Not unpleasant, not damp or stale in any alarming way, though there was the slight close quality of air that has not been circulated. Beneath that stone, well, the particular dry, dusty warmth of radiators and old books, and the specific scent of the house itself, which was not reducible to any of its components, but was simply, unmistakably, the smell of this house and no other place on earth. Constance stood in the hallway and breathed it. Her mother had died in the third week of October. It was now the second week of November. She had used the intervening weeks to manage the immediate necessities, the hospital paperwork, the registrar, the funeral, which was small and attended by people Constance half recognized and half did not, her mother's life in Hairswick having continued and deepened in the 20 years since Constance had effectively removed herself from it. There had been things to do. There had always been things to do, and doing them had been a mercy, because things to do left limited space for the other thing, the thing that was not doing but feeling, which she was aware was waiting for her with the same patience as this house. She put the key in her coat pocket. She walked through the hallway into the kitchen at the back of the house, which faced south over what remained of the kitchen garden, and stood at the kitchen window with her hands on the cold stone of the windowsill and looked out at the moor beyond the garden wall. The rain fell steadily. The moor received it without comment, which was the moor's habitual posture, the long, patient, geological accommodation of weather, of change, of everything that arrived and passed and left the moor essentially unchanged. Constance put the kettle on. She unpacked her mother's tea from the bag she had carried in from the car. Earl Grey, in the blue tin her mother had ordered by post for as long as Constance could remember from a supplier somewhere in Edinburgh. She found the mugs where they had always been, third cupboard on the left, above the worktop by the window. She found the teaspoon drawer. She found on the shelf above the stove where her mother had always kept it, a small jar of honey still half full, the lid sealed with the trace of the last time it had been used, the gold of it unchanged. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the tea in her hands and the rain in the window and the house quiet around her, not an empty quiet. She noticed immediately not the absence quality of a place where no one lives, but a full quiet, a held quiet, the quiet of a place that is occupied by memory so dense and so present that the air itself seems slightly thicker than elsewhere. She was home. God help her. She was home. She had told herself she would begin with the practical. The solicitor had been clear about the scope of the work. The estate was straightforward, the house owned outright, the will uncomplicated. Constance was the sole beneficiary. The question was simply what to do with the house. Keep it, let it, or sell it. Each option carried its own weight. None of them had declared itself obviously right in the 3 weeks since she had been aware they were her options. The practical course she had decided on the drive up was to go through the house room by room, to assess what was there, to make decisions about what to keep, what to donate, what to discard, to treat the house as what it factually was, a structure that had served its purpose and now needed to be considered clearly, without sentimentality. This plan had the merit of sounding reasonable in the abstract. Standing in the kitchen of Fell Cottage on a November morning with her mother's tea in her hands, it sounded considerably less convincing. She began anyway. She began with the sitting room, which was the room at the front of the house, the room with the 2 windows that overlooked the garden and the moor beyond, the room with the large fireplace, the room in which her childhood evenings had been spent in that particular configuration of activity and companionship that she had not had a name for as a child and could only describe now as family life, which was not a poetic description but was the accurate one. The room was exactly as she remembered it. Not in the static way of a museum, not preserved, not deliberately maintained in some past state. Simply continuous. The furniture was the same furniture she had grown up with, worn to a greater degree, but not replaced. The bookshelves that covered the wall to the right of the fireplace were the same bookshelves, filled now beyond their original capacity with additional volumes stacked horizontally on top of the vertically shelved ones, in the way that happens when a person has more books than space and is not prepared to address the imbalance by acquiring more space. The rug in front of the fireplace was different, newer though not new, and this small change somehow threw everything else into relief, made her register the continuity of everything else with greater precision. She walked to the bookshelves. Her mother had been a reader of extraordinary breadth and complete seriousness, the kind of reader who kept pencils in the kitchen specifically for the purpose of underlining in books, who made notes in the margins with the argumentative confidence of someone engaged in a genuine conversation rather than merely receiving a monologue, who reread things and mark different passages on the second reading and sometimes on the third, so that the books on these shelves were not merely books but records of a mind in dialogue with other minds across decades. Constance pulled a volume from the shelf. She opened it at random. Her mother's handwriting in the margin, the small, angular, entirely legible script she had maintained from some early decision about penmanship through to the last years when her hands were less steady and the letters had acquired a slight tremor that the underlying intention still made precise. A marginal note beside a passage about grief. Not absence. Rearrangement. Constance read those two words twice. She closed the book. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she set it carefully on the small table beside the armchair, her mother's chair, the one nearest the fire, and stood very still in the middle of the room and listened. The house was making sounds. Not alarming sounds. The specific vocabulary of old stone buildings in wet weather, the low resonant contraction of the walls as the temperature dropped, the particular percussion of the rain now on the window glass, a faint creak from the upper floor that was the floorboards accommodating the differential expansion of old wooden damp air. She knew all of these. She had gone to sleep to all of these as a child. But underneath them or alongside them, at a frequency that was not quite sound in the conventional sense, that registered not in the ear but somewhere in the chest or the spine, something else. She stood very still and attended to it. It was not a voice. She was clear on that immediately, and remained clear on it throughout everything that followed. Not her mother's voice. Not any voice. It was closer to the quality of a feeling that had been compressed into something very dense and was now, with her arrival, very slowly beginning to decompress. Like old wood swelling in rain. Like warmth returning to a room that has been closed. She sat down in her mother's chair. The chair received her with a slight yielding adjustment of old upholstery conforming to a familiar weight, and then a correction, a subtle resettling, as if registering that this weight was not quite the same, not quite the shape it was accustomed to. Different weight, a new one, but not unwelcome. She sat in her mother's chair in the sitting room of Fell Cottage on a November morning and listened to the house breathe and let whatever it was breathing toward her arrive without trying to name it. She found the box on the second day. She had been methodical about the rooms, the sitting room first, then the kitchen, which required less time because her mother had been unsentimental about practical things and the kitchen contents were either useful, in which case they needed to be kept or donated or spent, in which case they could simply be cleared. She had made lists. She had used the pad of notepaper she found in the kitchen drawer, her mother's notepaper, the thick cream kind she had always used, and she had written in her own handwriting, which was nothing like her mother's, lists of things with columns for keep, donate, and let go. The act of writing on her mother's notepaper had required, the first time, a significant act of will. The second time, it was merely difficult. By the third time, it was simply what she was using. The box was in the study. The study was the room at the back of the house, between the kitchen and the smaller of the two bedrooms, which had been Constance's room as a child and which she was sleeping in now. She had not been able to bring herself to sleep in her mother's room, and did not examine this decision for its implications because the implications were, she felt, sufficiently obvious to require no examination. The study had always been her mother's private room. Not locked, not forbidden, simply private in the way that certain spaces in a family home communicate their function without requiring explicit statement. As a child, Constance had knocked before entering the study. She had never come in without invitation. She was not entirely certain, standing at the door on the afternoon of her second day, that she had ever been in this room without her mother present. She stood at the threshold for a moment. Then she went in. The study was small and dense with the apparatus of her mother's inner life. A desk under the window that faced north, the deliberate choice of someone who understood that north-facing light is the honest light, the working light, the light that does not flatter and therefore does not deceive. On the desk, in the organized arrangement of a person who knew where everything was and required it to be exactly there, a lamp, a pen holder containing 3 pencils and a red pen, a stack of correspondence held together by a rubber band, a ceramic mug, empty clean, that held more pencils, and a small framed photograph. Constance picked up the photograph. It was her. Approximately 7 years old, standing in the garden in summer. She could tell it was summer by the wisteria behind her, purple and extravagant, and by the quality of the light. She was squinting slightly against the sun, and her expression was the expression of a child who has been asked to stop and stand still for a photograph when she would rather be doing something else, but who is cooperating because the person asking is someone she loves, and cooperation with people you love is one of the more straightforward expressions of that love. She did not remember this photograph being taken. She did not know when her mother had put it on the desk. She did not know how many years it had been sitting in this spot, this precise spot, in this north-facing study on this desk, while her mother worked. She set it down very carefully. She turned to the shelves along the left wall, which were lined not with books but with flat archive boxes, the kind used for document storage, pale gray cardboard, each labeled in her mother's handwriting with a date range and a category. Tax records, correspondence, research, house, garden. And at the end of the second shelf, a box labeled simply C. One letter. Her initial. Constance stood looking at it for a long moment. The rain, which had paused in the early afternoon to allow a brief, gray, non-committal sky, had returned now, tapping at the north window with a patient persistence of something that has made up its mind. She lifted the box from the shelf. It was heavier than she expected. Not dramatically heavier, not the weight of something startling, but substantial. Dense in the specific way that paper is dense, the way the accumulated weight of many sheets of written paper becomes, when gathered into a volume, a surprisingly serious thing. She carried it to the desk and sat down in her mother's chair, the worn wooden swivel chair that tilted slightly to the right and whose adjustment mechanism had been non-functional for as long as Constance could remember. Another imperfection long since accepted and incorporated into the routine of use. She opened the box. Inside, letters. Not letters that had been sent and received. Letters that had been written and kept. She could see immediately that most of them were unsealed, some of them unaddressed, some addressed in her mother's handwriting with a single word at the top, Constance. Constance. Her own name in her mother's hand on letter after letter. They were dated, she saw, as she lifted the first few carefully from the box. The earliest she could immediately identify was dated 12 years ago. Others were more recent. One she saw with a slight arrest of breath was dated the 14th of September of this year, 5 weeks before her mother had died, 1 week before the hospital admission. She did not read them immediately. She held the box in her lap and sat in the quiet study with the rain on the window and the house around her and understood, with a clarity that was physical in its quality, lodged in the body rather than the mind, that she was holding in this gray cardboard box the conversation that had not happened. 20 years of a conversation that had not happened. Her mother, who had been precise and reserved and not given to emotional exhibition of any kind. Her mother, who had said "I love you" in the way that certain people say it, as an understood truth that does not require constant reiteration. Her mother had been writing to her. Writing letters. Keeping them. Not sending them, perhaps because sending them would have required an opening of the distance between them that neither of them had managed to arrange. But writing them. Constance set the box down on the desk and pressed both hands flat on the lid. The rain fell steadily and completely on the moor and the garden and the roof of Fell Cottage, and the house absorbed it the way it had always absorbed everything, with patient, structural stoicism, holding each drop in the stone and the slate and the mortar, distributing the weight of it through the fabric of itself with the practiced efficiency of a building that has been doing this for a very long time and has learned that the way to survive weather is not to resist it, but to receive it and let it pass through by every route that gravity and architecture provide. She read the first letter that evening by the lamp on the desk in the study, with a second mug of her mother's tea growing cold beside her, and the rain still present outside as both sound and company. She had chosen the first letter in the box, the earliest one, because it seemed the correct place to begin, and because beginning at the beginning was a discipline she valued in all things, and because she needed, in this particular moment, the small comfort of a rule to follow. The letter was dated 11 years ago. Constance had been 27. She had been living in London for 9 years. She had spoken to her mother on the telephone on Sundays with a regularity that was conscientious and in depth that was. She could acknowledge this now in the study in the lamplight, holding the letter carefully managed. Constance had been, at 27, a person who managed things, who kept the difficult feelings at the correct professional distance and attended to the practical requirements of a life being built with deliberate and systematic care. The letter began without preamble, in her mother's characteristic way. I have been watching the moor in the rain today, which is something I do more than I admit to anyone, and I found myself thinking about you. Not with worry. I want to say that clearly, because I know you assume worry when I think about you, and you are partly right. But today it wasn't worry. Today it was something more like wonder. You have made yourself such a clear and capable and directed life, and I watch it from here, from this window, from this distance, with a mixture of pride and something I don't have quite the right word for. Not regret. Something adjacent to regret, but with more admiration in it. I wanted to tell you this. I have been wanting to tell you various things for some years, and I find that the telephone on Sunday afternoons, while it is something I look forward to in a way I look forward to reliable and good things, is not quite the right container for them. This, I have decided, might be. I don't know whether I will send this. I suspect not. But I'm going to write it anyway, because the writing is, as it always is, the point. You may or may not know this about yourself yet, but you are also a person for whom the writing is the point. You have your father's engineering mind and my need to put things into sentences, and the combination has made you someone who can build things that will stand and also feel them standing. That is not a small thing. The moor is very beautiful today. I hope London is being good to you. With love that I don't always find the right occasion to say. Mom. Constance put the letter down on the desk. She sat for a long time without moving. The lamp made its yellow circle on the desk. The rain made its sound on the window. The house settled and creaked in its familiar way around her, and the box sat beside the lamp, patient and full waiting. She read for 4 hours. Not all of the letters. There were more than she could count in a single evening, more than she had anticipated when she lifted the box from the shelf. She read perhaps a third of them, working forward through the years in order, the dates on each letter marking out a timeline of her own absence like mile markers on a road she had been driving without fully registering the distance. Mother wrote about them more, about the garden season by season, with the specific and loving attention of someone who has spent decades in the same garden and understands it as a living relationship rather than a project. The negotiation between what she wanted it to be and what it chose to become, the surprises and the disappointments and the recurring, reliable pleasures. She wrote about the village, the people Constance half remembered, their lives progressing in the way that lives in small places progress, the usual inventory of birth and marriage and death, and the smaller events that matter in specific lives without registering in wider ones. She wrote about books, about specific passages that had stopped her, specific ideas that had lodged in her, the arguments she had with authors in the margins of their pages, and the concessions she had been willing to make on rereading. And she wrote always about Constance, not in the way Constance had feared, not with reproach, not with the weight of the acknowledged distance between them. With the same tone she used for everything else, precise, warm, quietly humorous, and underneath all of it, irrevocably honest. "I miss you," one letter said simply, in the middle of an otherwise practical paragraph about the kitchen garden. Just that. "I miss you." And then, in the next line, something about the carrots. Constance's hands were not quite steady when she put that letter down. She found in the letters a version of her mother she had not known. Not because her mother had been concealing herself. She did not think that and would not have it. But because there is a version of a person that exists only in their most private register, the register of thought that has been allowed to move without the self-editing that conversation requires. The version of a person that sits at a desk on a rainy day and writes what is true rather than what is appropriate. Her mother was funny. This she had known. But on the page, her mother's humor had a looseness to it, a willingness to follow a comic thought further than she would have allowed herself in speech, that produced passages so genuinely, warmly funny that Constance laughed aloud in the quiet study, alone in the lamplight. Her mother was lonely. This she had known in the abstract without allowing herself to know it fully. On the page, in the letters that were not sent, this came through with a plainness that did not ask for sympathy but simply acknowledged the fact, the particular loneliness of a life lived well and fully and honestly in a small place after the person you had expected to share it with had left, and then after the child you had raised had, with the best intentions and the clearest possible purpose, also left. Her mother was proud of her. This she had known least, or had dismissed most quickly when she sensed it approaching, because pride has a complicated weight when it is mixed with distance and the years go on. On the page, the pride was unmistakable and specific, not the general parental pride that attaches to achievement, but the particular pride of someone who watches another person become more fully themselves and is glad of it, regardless of what that becoming costs in terms of proximity. You have never needed me to tell you what to do. The second to last letter read. It was dated 3 months before the end. You needed me to be here, in the background, reliably present, so that you could go and do the things you needed to do with the assurance that there was somewhere to come back to. I understood this. I was glad to be that. I want you to know that I was glad. And I want you to come home. Not permanently. Not if that doesn't suit you. But I want you to come home and see the moor and have tea and sit in the sitting room. And let me show you what the wisteria has done this year, because it is extraordinary, and I think you would appreciate it. I have been meaning to ask you for some time. I keep not asking. I don't know why I keep not asking. Pride, probably. The same pride you have, which you got from me, which is a useful thing and an occasionally obstructive one. Come home soon, Constance. The moor is very beautiful in September. Constance had not gone home in September. She had received no letter because the letter had not been sent. She had spoken to her mother on the telephone on the Sunday of that September, and her mother had said everything was fine, how was work, and Constance had said fine, busy, and they had spoken for 20 minutes about nothing in particular and ended the call with the words they always used, which were warm but insufficient, which were what they had, which were better than nothing but not what either of them meant. 3 weeks later, the hospital had telephoned. On the third night, it rained very heavily. The kind of rain that does not negotiate, the kind that arrives in the late evening with the finality of a decision already made and settles in for the night with no particular schedule for departure. The windows were gray-black with it. The gutters were running. The garden was invisible except for the nearest few feet, and even those were indistinct, seen through the curtain of falling water. Constance sat in the sitting room with a fire going. She had learned on her first evening that the fireplace still worked, the chimney clear, her mother having apparently maintained the fire as a winter habit that Constance remembered from childhood, and that had the quality of ritual rather than mere practicality. And she listened to the house in the rain. She had been listening to it for 3 days now. She had learned its vocabulary. The particular note the rain made on the east-facing windows versus the west. The way the sitting room absorbed sound differently from the study, the books on the shelves, she understood professionally, acting as acoustic insulation, making the room warmer and quieter in both the physical and the figurative senses. The note the fourth stair made, always the same note, always that specific creak, but having announced its position on that particular step for as long as she could remember, and presumably for decades before she was born to remember it. The house was full tonight in a way it had not been full before. She noticed it first as a quality of air, not a smell, not a temperature, but a density. The sense that the air in the rooms was carrying more than air usually carries. That it was charged, if that was not too electrical a word for something that was in fact very slow and very soft, with an accumulation of something she could not quite name. She thought about what the letters had told her. Her mother had lived in this house for 40 years. 40 years of days and evenings and nights, of winters and summers and all the particular seasons of a single life moving through a single place, grief and joy, and the long stretches of ordinary days that constitute the majority of any life and that are. She was beginning to understand, not the background against which the significant things happen, but the substance itself. The ordinary days, the tea and the books, and the moor and the rain and the garden and the Sunday telephone calls. The life lived continuously in this place. All of it received by these walls. All of it held. She closed her eyes. The fire crackled. The rain worked at the windows with its patient, unceasing attention. The house settled around her. And then slowly, in the way that things come when you have finally stopped trying to make them come, she began to feel it. Not a vision, not a sound, not any form of experience she would have to explain or defend or categorize. Simply memory, not her own, or not only her own, the memory of the house. 40 years of rain on these windows. 40 years of fire in this grate. 40 years of a woman sitting in the chair Constance now sat in, sometimes reading, sometimes writing, sometimes simply sitting in the way that people sit when they are thinking about something they may or may not find the words for. and the house absorbing all of it, holding all of it, the way stone holds warmth long after the sun has moved on. She felt her mother in the room, not a ghost. She would not use that word. She was a structural engineer, and she had a clear, scientifically literate mind, and she did not believe in ghosts in any folkloric sense. What she felt was something more honest than a ghost, the residue of presence, the trace that 40 years of inhabiting a space leaves in its fabric. The way a well-loved chair holds the shape of the person who sat in it. The way a kitchen holds the ghost of meals in its walls, and its floor, and the particular arrangement of its utensils. Not supernatural. Structural. The most honest kind of memory there is. Her mother had been here for 40 years. She was here still, in the only way that any of us persist, in the marks we have made on the places and the people we have loved, in the trace of our particular way of being in the world, encoded in everything around us that absorbed it and held it and has not yet let it go. Constance sat in the sitting room for a very long time. The fire burned down. The rain continued. She did not rebuild the fire or turn on additional lights or make another cup of tea. She simply sat and received and let the house tell her what it knew. On the fourth morning, Constance woke early. The rain had stopped in the night. She had been aware of it stopping without waking fully, the way you are aware of silence when something that has been providing constant sound ceases. The morning was very clear and very cold. The kind of November morning that comes after heavy rain, when the air has been cleaned to a sharpness that makes distance visible in a way that feels almost excessive. The hills to the north were distinct in every particular, every heather-covered fold and every boulder and every shadow precise as a line drawing. She made tea and took it outside into the garden. The garden in the morning after heavy rain was extraordinary. Every surface was wet and reflective. Every leaf and stem of the overgrown beds holding water with the careful self-importance of things performing a service. The dead stalks of the summer's plants were silver with moisture. The stone of the walls was darkened to a deep charcoal gray, almost black in places, and the moss on the top of the walls was so saturated it was practically luminescent. That same deep and somewhat improbable green that Constance associated, and would always associate with November mornings in this garden. The apple tree at the far end of the garden, her mother's apple tree, planted the year Constance was born, now grown to a substantial and architecturally interesting shape, was magnificent in the morning light. Its bare branches were still beaded with last night's rain, each bead catching the low November sun and holding it, so that the tree glittered softly, covered in temporary stars that will be gone by mid-morning and would not be missed because they belonged to this exact moment and were sufficient unto it. Constance stood in the wet garden with her tea and looked at the tree and understood that she was not going to sell the house. The understanding arrived not as a decision, but as a recognition, the kind of knowing that has been forming below the level of conscious thought for a considerable time and finally, when the conditions are right, surfaces. She had not been deciding whether to sell. She had been discovering whether she would. She would not. She went back inside and finished the inventory. She worked through the study with the care it deserved. Her mother's papers organized and boxed properly, the correspondence sorted, the practical documents gathered for the solicitor. She worked through the bedroom, her mother's bedroom, which she had been avoiding, and which she entered on this last morning with the same quality of careful breath she had used at the garden gate on the first day, and which received her with the same quality of held, dense, patient memory that the rest of the house had been offering since her arrival. She kept the books. All of them, the annotated, argued with, repeatedly read volumes with their pencil underlinings and their marginal conversations. She would have to build new shelves in London for some of them, and this seemed to her a perfectly reasonable domestic project, a good use of a winter weekend, something to plan. She kept the photograph from the desk, herself at 7, squinting in the summer wisteria light. She kept the box of letters. She kept the ceramic mug of pencils and the notepaper and the lamp and the chair that tilted slightly to the right, and she kept the foxhead door knocker, which was, she recognized now, not something that could be separated from the door without ceasing to be itself, and which therefore resolved the question of keeping the house very neatly. She kept her mother's chair in the sitting room, and the worn rug in front of the fireplace, and the particular quality of the light through the south kitchen window on a clear afternoon, which was not something she could pack and take to London, but which would be here when she came back, which she would. She would come back. She walked through the house room by room, not inventorying now, but simply walking, saying what needed to be said in the language of presence rather than words, which was the only adequate language for it, the only language old enough and patient enough to carry the full weight of what she was trying to say, which was something in the region of, I'm sorry for the distance, and I understand it better now than I could before, and I am not going anywhere. She stood at the back window of the kitchen for a long time. The moor stretched out before her, clear in the morning light, the hills to the north definite and patient as they had always been. A curlew called somewhere to the east. That long, descending, liquid note that is the sound of the more made audible, the sound that always made her think of openness, of the long view, of the particular freedom available only in places that are too large and too old to be impressed by human concerns. Her mother had watched this view for 40 years. I have been watching the moor in the rain. The first letter had begun. Constance watched it in the clear morning light and felt the distinction between those two weathers as the only vocabulary she needed for the difference between then and now. She had been in the rain for a long time. The morning was clear. She left Fell Cottage on the 5th day, in the early afternoon, with a car considerably fuller than it had arrived. The box of letters was on the back seat. 3 boxes of books were in the booth. The framed photograph was wrapped in one of her mother's scarves, a green wool one that had been draped over the back of the study chair, which she had pressed her face into once, briefly, on the first morning, before she had found the box, before she had read the letters, before she understood what this visit was going to be, and placed carefully between the boxes. The tin of tea was on the passenger seat again. It was nearly empty now. She stood at the car and looked at the house for a long moment before getting in. The house looked back with its 6 windows and its fox-head knocker and its wisteria porch and its 40 years of held memory, and it looked at her with the expression, if a building can be said to have an expression, and she was increasingly of the view that it can, of something that has said what it needed to say and is now comfortable in the knowledge that it was heard. "I'll be back in spring," she said. She said it as a promise and meant it as one, and this felt different from the ways she had made similar statements in the past, with the slightly raised inflection of the uncertain, a slight future conditional quality of statements that are more hope than intention. This was flat and specific and true. Spring. She would come when the wisteria was about to bloom. She would sit in the garden with tea and watch the moor come back into color, and she would read the remaining letters, the ones she hadn't yet reached, the ones still in the box, the ones her mother had written in the last year of her life when presumably she had known or suspected or simply wanted to prepare, and she would read them in the garden in the spring, in the place where they were written with the wisteria overhead. She got in the car. She drove down a track between the dry stone walls, out through the gate, and turned south onto the road that would take her back to the motorway and the south, and the life she had built with deliberate and systematic care, and which she was returning to. She understood now, with something she had not had when she arrived, a new kind of ballast. Not her mother. She was not sentimental enough to claim her mother was still with her in any simple or consoling sense. Her mother was gone. That was the plain, difficult, irreducible fact of it, and she was not going to insist on softening it. But the conversation was not over. 20 years of unwritten letters sat in a box on her back seat. She had not finished reading them. She would finish them slowly over the winter, one at a time in the evenings in London, with the lamp on and perhaps the window open slightly if the night was mild, so that she could hear the distant sound of the city that had been her life for 20 years while she read the words her mother had written from the place that had always been, in the deepest sense, home. And when she had read them all, she would write back. She knew this with the certainty of things that have been decided below the level of deliberation, not planned but known. She would write back. She would write letters to her mother from her flat in London about the work in the city and the people and the ordinary days that were the substance of her life. She would write honestly, the way her mother had written. She would put things in sentences that she had been keeping at the wrong distance for a long time. She would not send them, of course. That was not the point. The writing was the point. She had always known this, but she understood it better now. She went back in April. The wisteria was not yet in full bloom. She had arrived, she calculated afterward, about 10 days early for the best of it, which meant she had a reason to return in May, and after that in summer, and after that in the autumn when the moor came into its own again. The garden had survived the winter in its self-directed way, negotiating the cold and the wet and the long, still February weeks according to its own established protocols. The apple tree had come through with the same expression of architectural indifference it brought to all weather. The first wisteria buds were present on the porch, dense and promising, not yet open. She sat in the garden in the mild April morning with the last of the letters from the box, and a mug of tea, and the sound of the curlew from the moor, and the smell of the wet earth warming, and she read the last letter her mother had written. It was dated the 14th of September, 5 weeks before the end, 1 week before the hospital. It was short. Her mother's handwriting was slightly less steady than in earlier letters, the tremor evident, the letters a little larger and more deliberate, the lines still moving slightly downhill across the page. Dear Constance, the moor is doing something extraordinary today. I cannot describe it precisely, but there is a quality of light on it this morning that makes me want to sit very still and not miss any of it. I have been sitting at the kitchen window for an hour. I'm going to stop writing letters and start sending them. I know I have said this before and not done it. This time I mean it. I'm going to call you on Sunday and ask you to come home, and I'm not going to let pride make the question smaller than it is. If I don't do it this Sunday, forgive me. I'm working on it. The wisteria this year was extraordinary. I wish you had seen it. With all my love, always. Mom. Constance sat with the letter in her lap and the apple tree's shadow moving slowly across the garden in the morning light, and the wisteria budding over the porch above her, and the moor doing whatever it was doing today. Which she could see from where she sat was something quiet and vast and entirely indifferent to calendar, and therefore entirely reliable. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat against her chest. Then she took out her own notebook, the one she had bought in London specifically for this purpose in January, in the quiet week after Christmas when she had begun the first of her replies, and she opened it to the next blank page, and she wrote, "Dear Mom, the wisteria is almost ready. I'm here. I'll wait for it. The moor is very beautiful today. I'm glad I came home." The house stood in its garden at the edge of the moor, gray stone in the April light, 6 windows open to the mild day. The wisteria preparing its annual spectacle with characteristic patience, and the foxhead knocker on the oak door catching the morning sun and holding it briefly, in the way that old things hold everything they are given. The rain would come again. It always did. And the house would receive it as it had always received it, quietly, structurally, with the long and practiced generosity of something that understands that holding is not hoarding. That to hold something is not to keep it forever, only to keep it long enough for the right person to come home and find it waiting. And the house that remembered rang, an original story, Sleepy Story Haven. And there, my dear wanderers, is where we rest. In the garden, in the April light, with the wisteria almost ready and the letter written and the moor doing what the moor does, which is simply to continue with magnificent and steadying indifference, being exactly itself. I find myself thinking after every episode of this kind about the things we don't say to the people we love. Not because we don't feel them, we feel them completely, but because the feeling is too large for the ordinary container of a Sunday afternoon phone call. Because we are waiting for the right moment, the right words, the right configuration of time and courage, and the willingness to be imprecise when precision fails. The moment Constance's mother was waiting for was always now, as all moments are. I hope tonight's story gave you something worth keeping. Some small, quiet permission to begin the conversation you've been composing in the back of your mind. You don't have to send it. The writing is the point. But perhaps eventually send it. If this episode found you at the right hour, please share it with someone who might need it. Stories like this one find their people slowly, quietly, through the kind of recommendation that comes from one thoughtful person saying to another, "I was listening to something last night, and I thought of you." The night is quiet now, and everything is at rest. Let go of the day, release every thought, and allow sleep to come naturally. With each breath, sink deeper into comfort and stillness. May your sleep be long, peaceful, and undisturbed. Good night. Until then, sleep well. Dream of old houses and clear mornings and the particular patience of wisteria, which knows exactly what it's doing and is in no hurry at all. Good night.